To a couple of you in the audience that I'm not an expert on Jane Austen at all. In fact, I'm not an expert on anything. I'm a cabbage. And there are two types of people in this world. There are cabbages and carrots. And cabbages are broad and green and spread on the surface, and carrots are thin and go very deep and drill down. Most academics are carrots, but I'm unusual. I'm a cabbage academic. I'm very broad, I'm on the surface, so I don't know anything in any great depth, but I know a bit about a lot of things. But my thing I know quite a lot about, in fact, is the history of English publishing through the 18th, 19th and early 20th centuries. It's largely, it's in the genes. My grandfather was a printer publisher, and so my whole family has a bit of printing history imbued in it. So I'm going to talk about Jane Austen and her publishers, a bit about Jane Austen, but more about the publishers, and hopefully tell you a bit about some of the publishers that you won't know. And I know that some of the things I say nobody knows about because I've only just researched some of it, and I'm about to write a paper on it. Okay, so how do you get published is the first question to ask. It's not obvious. And in the late 18th, early 19th century, really four things you could do. This was your choice. You could sell your copyright to a publisher. That's good. You got a lump sum of cash in your hand, but that's all you ever got from that publication. There was no royalties that would ever follow that. You could publish at your own expense. That's okay, because you've got to get all the profits essentially from that. Not all, because you actually have to pay a royalty back to the publisher. Little known fact. The publisher's not going to do it for nothing. So he gets a royalty on every copy sold. Of course, that encourages him to sell copies for you. But you have to put up the large sum of money to get the thing printed in the first place. So you take the risk. But you keep the copyright for the length of the copyright, and you get the benefit of all future editions. The first model, if you sell the copyright, the publisher gets the benefit of all future editions. So it's a choice you have to make. If you know lots of rich people, you publish by subscription. You write, like Susanna, who knows lots of rich people, she writes a letter to all her friends saying, I'm going to publish a book called You Beaut Jane Austen. It's going to cost £1 guinea each, and if you send me your guinea, I promise you'll get a copy of the book. When enough people have responded with their guineas, she then writes the book and then publishes it and gives them their copy. So that way she's guaranteed not to lose money on it, and with a bit of luck, if she gets her sums right, make money on it. So publishing by subscription, but you need to know a lot of people who will sub up the subscription. Or publishing in parts as a serial. This did happen back at that period, but became very popular in the mid-19th century. Lots of advantages to this. You can divide your book up into 20 parts and just publish the very first part, 1/20th of the work. Nominally then, notionally, at 1/20th of the cost of publishing the whole thing. It's like putting a toe in the water. Is it going to sell? So you print 500 copies, say. If they all sell quickly, when you go to print the second part, you print 1,000 copies. And so you go on. And so you spread the load and spread the capital call across all of the parts. And if you're someone like Dickens, you haven't even written the thing completely when you started selling the parts. And he made use of this by getting feedback from his audience about how the story was going, and would change the direction depending on what the public thought of the parts. Sam Weller was introduced in part 6 of Pickwick Papers. He was going to be a minor character, but he was so popular he became one of the major characters. So if you think about it, it's something that modern authors who don't publish serially don't have the advantage of. You can't make the book fit the desires of your audience. So parts as a serial, Dickens, Thackeray, Trollope, George Eliot, Wilkie Collins, Thomas Hardy, all published in serial parts. So it became a very accepted way of doing it. Well, I'm going to take Fanny Burney as an example of publishing. It's a very good parallel with Jane Austen. I'm sure many of you will have seen this before. Fanny Burney was born exactly 23 years before Jane Austen and died exactly 23 years after Jane Austen died. She lived to 88. Now, we always say, oh, Jane Austen died so young, what could she have published had she lived longer? 88 years, 4 novels. So longevity does not mean you're going to publish lots. It depends on what happens in your life between, which has affected Fanny Burney. But 3 famous books, Evelina, Cecilia and Camilla, one not so well-known book, The Wanderer, But what she then became most famous for were the letters and diaries, which were published posthumously by Henry Cockburn. But because they were published, we know all the details of how she got the other things published, because she wrote them in her diaries, and they were saved and published. If Jane Austen had only written diaries which had survived, we might know more about how her books were published. And this is one thing we know, how much she got for them. And so her very first book, she was 6 years old, written anonymously because she didn't want her dad to know she was writing it. Her father was Dr. Charles Burney, a very famous musicologist. She didn't think he would approve, so the first book, Evelina, which was her most famous, most popular, is totally anonymously published. You don't even know if it's a male or female. It's not by a lady or by a gentleman, anonymous. And her brother James took it to the publisher to sell the copyright, pretending he had written it. And James Burney, interestingly enough, ended up as Admiral Burney in the Navy. He may have known Jane Austen's brothers, I don't know, but what he did do is sail on 2 of Captain Cook's voyages to the Pacific. Anyway, he wasn't a very good copyright salesman, because he only got £21 for one of the great books of English literature. But he was naive, he'd never dealt with a bookseller before. 4 years later, at which point Lowndes had sold 6 different editions of Evelina, laughing all the way to the bank for his payout of £21. Fanny had produced Cecilia. She took it to a different publisher, because I suspect she was a bit hacked off at Lowndes. She took it to Thomas Cadell, and on the basis of the popularity of Evelina, she managed to get £250 for the copyright. 200, that's far more than Jane Austen ever got for any of her copyrights. Just on the reputation of Evelina. And Cecilia was published also anonymously, except it was by the author of Evelina. And everybody in London society knew who that was by then, because her father, Dr. Burney, found out and told his friends, like Dr. Johnson and other well-known people, so everybody in London knew that although this was anonymous, it was Charles Burney's daughter had written these. Long gap then for Camilla to come, and what happened was that Fanny Burney became a member of Queen Charlotte's entourage for 5 years, and she kept writing her journal, which she'd started when she was 16 years of age, but stopped writing novels. She wrote a few plays that were never published in her lifetime. In fact, quite a few plays. They were first published in the 1990s, when manuscripts were rediscovered. One of her plays was actually acted during her lifetime. It made a whole run of 1 performance before it was pulled. So I don't know what it was like. What she did was very clever though. Because she had been in the royal entourage, she wrote to all those rich friends, just like Susanna would write to all her rich friends, saying, I'm about to publish another book. I've published Evelina Cecilia, and I'm coming out with Camilla. If you give me a guinea, you get a copy. She got more than 1,250 people to put their hand up and say, yep, we'll do that. And so she published the first edition of Camilla, having pre-sold 1,200 copies at a guinea each. She made £1,000 from that. Then she turned around to the publisher, Cadell and Davis, this is Thomas Cadell Jr., the son of the original one, and said, okay, that was the first edition, that was mine, you can now buy the copyright from me for another £1,000. And they did. So she got £2,000 for Camilla, a very clever strategy. And she was making up for that big gap she'd had in her publication record of 14 years by leveraging off all those famous people she had met in that intervening time. And then The Wanderer, an 18-year gap, but she went to them and said, hey, I'm the publisher of Evelina Cecilia and Camilla, and I demand £1,500 for my copyright, and they paid it. It was a flop. So Longmans took the hit, not Fanny Burney. So very interesting. There's somebody, a woman who very successfully, from an unknown, only 4 novels over a period almost as long as Jane Austen's lifetime, still did very well financially from it and built her career well. So it could be done, is the message from this. And Fanny Burney, I think, is a very important example to female authors who came later. And we know about this, as I said, because of the letters and diaries, for which she got nothing, for the reason that she was dead. And in fact, it was her niece who was responsible for their publication. Now, of course, we know that Jane Austen knew about Fanny Burney and had read her books for this famous passage from Northanger Abbey, which I'm not going to read, but I point out that she uses two of Fanny Burney's books as her exemplars, Cecilia and Camilla, and then the third one she mentions in this passage is Belinda by Mrs. Edgeworth. And I agree with your upcoming speaker, this is clearly the greatest book by Jane Austen, because it's the one in which she talks about writing. Here's my copies of Cecilia and Camilla, first edition of Camilla, seventh edition of Cecilia, which came out the same year. We know that Jane Austen had this one. I suspect that the Austen family probably had the seventh edition because the first 5 editions certainly sold quite a lot earlier. 6 and 7 came out. 6 came out, I think, in 1793, 7 in 1796. So I think they probably would have had one of those too, but we don't know which one. We have the list of subscribers for Camilla, and you see the first 2 are members of the royal family, and it's an alphabetical list in rank order. Britain is always about rank and social standing. And the second page is terrific because, of course, the second last name in the A's is Miss J. Austen Steventon. So she was the second lowest ranked A person. But look at the list of the names at the top of the B's. Duke, Duchess, 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 Marquis, Countess, Earl, Countess, 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 Viscountess. That's why you publish by subscription, when you know people like that. Absolutely extraordinary. Interesting enough, there's a couple of publications now analysing the list of subscribers. And these names appear in the list too, which is interesting. Other female authors, Maria Edgeworth, Hannah More, Anne Radcliffe, all subscribed. Interesting. And that subscription record has become quite a lot of interest to people researching this period, trying to identify who all the people are, particularly the less notable people.
Chris, how would the less notables have heard about?
Because some of them are family friends and from the same places where she had lived. Some of them are Austen family friends. There's quite a few Austen family friends in the list, and people from around the Berkshire area where part of the Burney family had lived. Some from King's Lynn, where Dr. Charles Burnley was from. So the analysis has actually been done. Astonishing bit of work. So this is my copy of Camilla. It's got F. Camden on each title page and the Camden coat of arms here, because my copy was owned by a subscriber, as most of them would have been, and it was this woman here, Frances Countess of Camden. This is her portrait by Lawrence, which is in the Huntington Library in Pasadena, and I've been to pay homage because it means a lot to me. Bizarrely, by coincidence, my very first serious girlfriend was the sister of the current Countess of Camden. I let that one slip, unfortunately. The Honourable Lady Maria, bless her. Cecilia, of course, is famous, and we know is famous for suggesting Pride and Prejudice as the title to Jane Austen. Page 303 of volume 5 has Pride and Prejudice 3 times in capitals. And clearly, at the time when she's considering changing first impressions to Pride and Prejudice, this has had a big influence. There's another influence, though, of Fanny Burney, and that's on the first attempt of Jane Austen to be published. So this is the letter from Reverend George Austen to Thomas Cadell Jr., the publisher of Camilla, about a year after Camilla comes out. And it starts, "I have in my possession a manuscript novel comprising of 3 volumes about the length of Miss Burney's Evelina." You can see he's trying to get a link by association here. He goes on to ask, would you be interested in buying the copyright? If so, how much? Or would you be interested in, or could you tell me, sorry, how much it would cost me for the family to publish it? And would you be interested in that? His answer is, written on the top in the hand of Thomas Cadell Jr., declined by return of post. This was almost certainly Pride and Prejudice turned down sight unseen, because it's only the letter was sent, not the manuscript. So what could have been didn't happen. And just imagine what might have come from Jane Austen had she been first published in 1797, not 1811. So interesting that letter has survived. Second try of publication came a little while later. Susan was sold to Benjamin Crosby by Mr. Seymour, who was a lawyer who worked with Henry in his banking business in London. £10. Blimey, Fanny Burney's brother did better 25 years earlier. £10 is not much for a copyright, even by an unpublished, unknown author. We think that Crosby must have intended to publish because he advertised it twice as coming up for publication in his own publications, but a third time, in a trade publication, which we know he would have paid cash money to get into the trade publication. Now, he's not going to have placed that ad unless he had an intention of publishing. But it never became published. Eventually, Jane Austen famously writes to Crosby's in 1809 a letter where she signs herself with a masculine name, saying, "What's happened to my book, Susan? Why haven't you published it?" And got a very tart letter back from, in fact, Richard Crosby, because Benjamin had died by then. This business had been taken over by his son, Richard, saying, "We bought the copyright, we didn't promise to publish it, basically. If you want it back, give me £10. Brusquely, almost as brusquely as that, and the tone of his letter. Jane Austen didn't have the £10 to buy the copyright in 1809, and it wasn't until 1815, after she successfully published several books, that Henry then buys Susan back from Richard Crosby for £10, and then triumphantly tells him, "Oh, you've just sold me the copyright of a book from the author of Sense and Sensibility and Pride and Prejudice for not very much." And of course, Jane Austen goes on to revise Susan, calls it Catherine, and writes a preface. Now, this is interesting. Because of this publication history, it's the only Jane Austen novel with a preface, which she calls an apology. And it's an apology, of course, for not getting the thing published at the time that she wrote it. Even after she had retitled it Catherine, another Catherine comes out. Two books called Catherine come out in about 18 months. And so eventually it's renamed Northanger Abbey and published posthumously, almost certainly the name given by Henry, but we don't know for certain. And interestingly, the year after this, Thomas Love Peacock publishes one of his, it's not really a Gothic novel, but it's a satirical novel set in a Gothic kind of milieu, which he called Nightmare Abbey. And it's interesting whether he had taken the Nightmare Abbey from Northanger Abbey, because it comes out 1 year later. You can read much more about this in a wonderful book by Margie Burns called Publishing Northanger Abbey. She published a small part of this in one of the JASA papers, but then she's published it as a full book in 2020. It's a terrific read. And she has done all the investigation behind this story, which I've summarised on a single slide. And to finish on Fanny Burney, you all know the Pride and Prejudice Peacock edition, but did you know that there's an Evelina, also illustrated by Hugh Thompson? They make a lovely matching pair. So here's my copy of each of them. And Evelina is hard to read now. It's a epistolary novel. The later ones aren't. They're more of a narrative style novel. I find Camilla, I've read them all, but I find Camilla the most appealing of them, of the three. And The Wanderer is almost unreadable. So, okay, we'll move on to the first actual publisher of Jane Austen. This is Thomas Egerton. I'll be the first person you'll ever see put up his birth date, which is 1748. So I discovered about 2 months ago his birth date, and he died in 1830. I found his will as well. So I've actually found out a lot about the family. And this is the best picture I have of him. What I can assure you, you'll find things all over the web saying this is Thomas Egerton, Jane Austen's publisher. Well, I'll show you 4 people who aren't. He isn't. This is Thomas Egerton, Chancellor to James I. This is Thomas Egerton, his son, a well-known Whig politician. This is Thomas Egerton, his great-nephew, who was a general. And this is Thomas Egerton, who spent too much time in this Thomas Egerton, which was named after the very first one I showed you. These are all from a family of North Cheshire, South Lancashire. They became ennobled because of the first one, who became the Chancellor to James I, and then nothing to do with James Egerton, the publisher, as far as I can't find any link. So who was James Egerton, the publisher? Well, he was born in December 1748 in Cripplegate, London. He was baptised in January 1749. So a few people give his birth date as 1749, but it's wrong. It's his christening date, 1749. He was the oldest of 6 sons of Thomas and Jane Egerton. Thomas Egerton Sr. was a cordwainer, which means a shoemaker. And in fact, one of the other sons went on to become a shoemaker. He became a bookseller, publisher from 1782 with his brother John, younger brother John, almost certainly because John married a woman called Mary Davis, who was the daughter of a well-established London bookseller called Lockyer Davis, who was in Paternoster Row. And so that's the only link I can find between the Egerton family and publishing. It seems reasonable. Although how he met Mary Davis, we don't know. John sadly died in his early 40s, and so Thomas Egerton carried on the business by himself after John's death. He retired at age 78 in 1826. The business went to his assistant, and he died in August 1830. And I was able to work out his family details a lot from his will, which has survived, and I was able to locate and to read, which was quite hard. And work out, because he unfortunately he's got lots of codicils. He left in 1826 when he wrote the will his various bits and pieces to lots of his relatives, who managed to unfortunately die between 1826 when he wrote the will and 1830 when Thomas Egerton died. So the will kept having to be upgraded to allow for that. This is very useful when you're doing research on these people, because you can find their deaths. Not so good for the family. So we know Thomas Egerton then published Sense and Sensibility, Pride and Prejudice and Mansfield Park, the first editions. And if you look, you can see clearly on this one, printed for T. Egerton, Military Library, Whitehall. So what's the Military Library, Whitehall all about? And where is it? Well, this is a surviving business card of Thomas Egerton. Bookseller, successor to Mr. Millen, 32, opposite the Admiralty, Charing Cross. Military books in all languages. Why is he publishing Jane Austen, you may ask? Well, this is what we know about the Whitehall Military Library. Very quickly, it was almost certainly founded by John Millen. We can't find an earlier reference to it other than John Millen's in the 1720s. He retired in 1782 and sold the business to Thomas and John Egerton. Thomas ran the business, as I said, after John died. Thomas retired. He then sold it to his assistant, Francis Pinckney, which meant, just getting ahead of myself a little bit, that the Pride and Prejudice copyright passed to Thomas Pinckney in time. And Thomas Pinckney ran the business until his death in 1844. And Thomas Pinckney's uncle, funnily enough, lived at one point next door to Henry Austen in London, in Covent Garden. It was a smaller city in those days, but still you wonder about some of these little coincidences. This is the only description we have of the Whitehall Military Library. I won't read through the whole thing, except to point to the very last bit. It's by Richard Gough, who's a very well-known English antiquarian of the time. He discovered the famous old map of the coast of Britain, which shows the first English map that shows Atlantis, amongst other things. Very interesting man in his own right. But the last bit says, I emerged from this shop, which I consider as a future Herculaneum, where we shall hereafter root out many scarce things now rotting on the floor, considerably sunk below the level of the new pavement. In other words, the whole place is a shambles. This is in Millen's time. We don't know, there is no description of it in Egerton's time. It's close to here. This is a landmark area of London. This is a postcard from 1901. If you look at all those buildings, the only one that was present in Jane Austen's lifetime was the church, which is St Martin in the Fields. Not one of those other buildings was there. St Martin in the Fields, interestingly, is where Thomas Egerton was buried. That's a map of how it looks today. Trafalgar Square, you can see, let me use the pointer. Trafalgar Square, Nelson's Column, Charing Cross. This is Whitehall, this is the Strand. This is Pall Mall East, with Pall Mall running down here somewhere. Here's Admiralty Arch, here's the Mall running down here. That's how it looks today. It's not how it looked in Jane Austen's day. There's a map of it, but don't panic, I've got one that's a bit easier to read. But it's quite interesting. Here's the Queen's Palace at that point there, which we now call Buckingham Palace. And of course that's where Fanny Burney was with Queen Charlotte for 5 years. And this is James Park. There's no sign of the Mall running through there. Look at the map, almost identical map, but this is from 1817, same view as the first one. So where Trafalgar Square is now was the King's Mews. That's where the King kept his horses and carriages. King lived up in St James's Palace up here, and the Queen lived down in the Queen's Palace, now Buckingham Palace, at the end of St James's Park. Strand, Charing Cross, Whitehall, Cockspur Street, all still there. Pall Mall, no Admiralty Arch, it would have been across here, and the Mall would have been running through here. So completely different layout. Interesting enough, quite a few booksellers were in the King's Mews in that time, and it was got rid of to make Trafalgar Square. And it always fascinates me as a Londoner, former Londoner. The Battle of Trafalgar, of course, as you all know, was 1805. Trafalgar Square got finally completed in 1839. And here in 1817, not even thought of. It's quite extraordinary. So it's not just the Victorian state government, it takes a long time to build infrastructure. Moving on. This is where, in fact, Egerton's office was. That's number 32. There's the Admiralty as it was. So that's where it was. And we know that Jane Austen visited there. And we know Jane Austen visited here, because that's Carlton House. But we know the date. She famously visited Mr. Clark, the librarian of the Prince Regent. So we know that she's visited at least 2 buildings in that area. Well, we know something else about the books that were sold by Egerton. Here's a list. There's a receipt of books bought by this gentleman. Anybody tell me who this is? Very good. So and somebody should get it in this city. It's Governor Lachlan Macquarie, who bought books from Thomas Egerton. And these are the books he bought. So Bell's Magazine was the Times of its day. It was the publication of record, if you like, for Britain until the Times took that mantle from them. He bought from May to July issues. Campaigns of Prince Blucher, Heroes of Waterloo, Lord Byron's Hebrew Melodies, if anybody wants to know, I can tell you all about that, it's a bizarre book. Army and Navy lists, general regulations and orders, and the prices are over there. The most expensive was the Campaigns of Prince Blucher, 18 shillings for the 3-volume set. Same price as Sense and Sensibility, first edition. And the whole lot, Macquarie paid £2.01 for through a Major Gosling. So these books are mostly military and they're selling for a few shillings typically. And the 3-volumers tend to be 18 shillings because it's 6 shillings a volume typically for those sort of things. The cheapest one was the Heroes of Waterloo, which is 1 6p, but that must be a little pamphlet. This is August the 7th, 1815, 6 weeks after the Battle of Waterloo. So someone's got out a quickie and cheapie about the Heroes of Waterloo and is capitalising on the great interest in Waterloo. So that's an interesting Australian connection between Egerton through Governor Macquarie. Here are some titles published by Egerton in 1817. I did this and I searched these on Abe a few weeks ago, so you can buy these. They're out there for your hard-earned. So Regimental Companion, A Treatise on the Defence of Portugal, General Orders of Spain and Portugal, Account of Conquest of Mauritius, Sense and Sensibility. You know which one stands out as being different from the others? I wonder. Because I searched on I can tell you 2 things about them. This was 18 shillings. Each of these, as far as I can tell, were less than 6 shillings each, right? In 1811. Today, this will cost you about $1,000. These 2 cost you about $500. This one costs you $10,000. This one costs you nearly $250,000 Australian. Why is this one 10,000, do you think? Who do you think the author was? Wellington. It's Wellington's account of the Peninsular War through his dispatches. So it's a very collectible book today. So yes, there's one copy of Sense and Sensibility. I checked this morning actually. It's still for sale, Susanna, so you can get your hand in your pocket. It's a snit. It's absolute steel at 235,000 Australian dollars roughly. So why on earth would Egerton be the publisher? Well, there's 2 reasons, I suspect. One of them is The Loiterer. And The Loiterer was a magazine published by James and Henry Austen when they were at Oxford together. And if you look here, The Loiterer's London distributor was Egerton's, because John was still alive when that came out in the early 1790s. And so Henry and James would have known about Egerton's through that. But of course, Henry had an interesting career. He was a scholar. It was thought he was going to become an academic, but then he joined the Oxford Militia and then the Regulars, and so he had a military career. Then he became a banker, but a banker to the military. And what he was basically doing was helping transfer funds from Whitehall to the regiments out in the regions. So he would have known the Whitehall Military Library through that work. And then when his bank went bust in 1816, he became a clergyman for the rest of his life. So he had two reasons for knowing about Egerton's: the military banking and the Loiterer. And just in parenthesis, no aspersions cast on Henry for going bust in 1816, but half of the English banks went bust in 1816 for the reason end of the Napoleonic Wars. And that caused an immediate economic collapse in Britain and killed off a lot of small banks. So, the next thing that happened, of course, was Pride and Prejudice was published by Egerton. This is what Jane Austen says about that in one of her letters to Cassandra. P&P is sold. Egerton gives £110 for it. I would rather have had 150, but we could not both be pleased. I think that's lovely. And so I'm not at all surprised that he should choose to hazard so much. Its being sold will, I hope, be a great saving of trouble to Henry, and therefore must be welcome to me. This is Jane Austen telling us that it's Henry who's paid for the publication of Sense and Sensibility, or even more likely, Henry's bank has paid for it. Because my estimation, and it's an estimation we don't know, no Egerton records have survived, it would have cost about £300 to £350 to have printed the first edition of Sense and Sensibility. Jane didn't have £350 to spend on that, but Henry's bank would have. And so she's, I think, more pleased to sell the copyright to P&P so she doesn't put that pressure on Henry again. So here's some of the other titles published by Egerton in 1813. Again, I've searched on Abe, what can I buy from Egerton, published in 1813? The Bombardier and Pocket Gunner. Can I tell you, it's sold since I did this search. I looked again this morning, it's gone. Someone's bought it. And I've forgotten what the price was now. Instructions and Regulations for Formations and Movements of Cavalry. It's still for sale. It's the 9th edition. It will cost you about $1,000 today. Historical and topographical account of Fulham, including the hamlet of Hammersmith. 5 copies of this for sale currently, depending on whether you have the extra colour plates in or not, between about $400 and $2,000. Extraordinary. And extraordinary so many have survived. It was published by subscription through Egerton's, presumably by locals in the Fulham and Hammersmith area. And then Pride and Prejudice, a mere snippet at the bottom. And the currently available first edition of Pride and Prejudice has got $275,000 on it currently. The good news is you can always say to yourself, well, that's the price for which no one's been prepared to pay so far. But it will sell for somewhere in the 250 region, I would guess. We know that Jane and Henry visited Thomas twice in 1814. In September, they went to get the money for the first edition of Mansfield Park. And shortly after that, they found out that that first edition had sold out. So they went back to Egerton and said, can you please publish a second edition of Mansfield Park? You've sold out the first edition. And he prevaricated and then said no. And you can see a little bit later whether that was a good decision or not. He did publish other editions though. Egerton published the second edition of Sense and Sensibility and the second edition of Pride and Prejudice, both towards the end of 1813. Pride and Prejudice did very well because the first edition was January-February 1813. The second edition comes out in November 1813, so it sold out all 1,000 within the year and been reprinted within the year. That's always a good sign for a book in these days. He then produced a third edition of Pride and Prejudice in 1817. And of course, we all know that Jane died in July 1817. The earliest surviving copy with a datable inscription of the third edition is dated September 1817. So the guess, as I said, the Egerton records haven't survived. The guess is that he found out that Jane had died and rushed this out quickly as soon as he could after he found that out. And so somewhere around August, September, it was probably published. And this is my copy of it. It's a 2-volume, it's the first 2-volume edition. It's on crappy paper, it's poorly printed, the margins have been made narrow, the text has been scrunched up a bit. And I don't know if you can see from there on the slide if it's come out, but there's actually a pentimento effect of the print on the other side of the paper comes through. I think you can see it on the slide. You certainly see it on the page because the paper's so thin and horrible. And in fact, Henry and Jane objected to the quality of the paper that Egerton's had been, or Roworth, who was the printer for Egerton's, had been using. But this is important because Egerton published the second edition of Pride and Prejudice because he owned the copyright, and the third edition because he owned the copyright, and didn't have to go back to the family about them, didn't consult the family about the text, and the text is different from the first to the second to the third editions, minor changes, mostly compositor and printer errors. But this third edition became the standard text of Pride and Prejudice that was used for the next 100 years, and is, of the 3 editions, the worst. So from about 1817 to 1923, that's what people used as the text of Pride and Prejudice, and it's the worst possible text. So it had a bad influence, unfortunately. Well, here's a simple question for this audience. What do these 7 men have in common?
Are they all John Murrays?
They're all John Murrays. They're all the 7 John Murrays, okay? Do you know, I have to be a little disappointed. When I showed this slide in Melbourne, the whole audience shouted out to me, they're all John Murrays. I suspect they must have had a speaker recently who showed us a similarly concocted slide.
I've met the last one.
Yeah, so have I, yes. So that's what they have in common. Here's the harder question. Which were not christened John Murray? And here's the answer, those 2. And that's because the founder was born John MacMurray in Edinburgh. He was a Marine officer, and he thought that sounded too Scottish, so he changed his name to Murray, as somehow not sounding Scottish, when he moved to London. And then one of the John Murrays didn't have any children, but he had a sister called Dorothy, who married someone called Gray, and Dorothy Gray had a son called John Jock Arnold Robin Gray, and he was therefore, if this is a succession of royalty, he was the next one in line and was persuaded to take over the firm as long as he changed his name to John Murray, which he did, and that became this John Murray. That's the John Murray II, who was the publisher of Jane Austen, and they're referred to as if they were a royal dynasty. They refer to as if they were kings. In one slide I've tried to summarise what they did, which is very hard to do, but John Murray I founded the firm, was an absolute wastrel and drunkard in his later years, and the firm almost collapsed. He made some money and then drank and gambled it and womanised it away. So bad that the firm was put into almost a sort of receivership when he died, and also John Murray II was quite young when his father died, and was run under a sort of trust for about a decade before John Murray II took it over. And he made a huge success of the firm, really made the firm. You see, he had Jane Austen, Sir Walter Scott, Lord Byron, not bad to have on your authors list. And it goes on, they all did pretty well. John Murray VI, the one who changed his name, also had a wonderful list of authors. John Murray VII realised that the writing was on the wall for small private English publishers and sold to Hodder's in 2002. Hodder's then was sold to somebody else, who then sold to Hachette, who is now owned by, no, it's still independent, it's owned by, no, I've forgotten who it's owned by. It's like big fish swallowing small fish. Most importantly though, John Murray VII sold the Murray Archive to the National Library of Scotland in Edinburgh, £17 million. Fortunately, the British Lottery paid most of the tab for that, and so we have a lot of information about the Murray publishing dynasty through the keeping of those records. Some of them are now digitised, and if, like me, you've got an academic affiliation and an academic library usage, you can actually read some of those archives directly, which I've done. And there's some interesting stuff in there. So John Murray VII, bless him, did a very good job for posterity by making sure those archives were preserved. John Murray III is an interesting thing in the archive. In 1859, I received a manuscript from an author with a letter. It may be a conceit, but I believe the subject will interest the public, and I'm sure that the views are original. If you think otherwise, I must repeat my request that you will freely reject my work. Though I should be a little disappointed, I shall be in no way injured. And that was Charles Darwin about the origin of the species. And most importantly, the letter and the manuscript are preserved in the John Murray archives and now sit in the National Library of Scotland. So the John Murray archive is more important than just the business records of the firm. It's got lots of manuscripts in it. Now here's two other Murray publications. Childe Harold's Pilgrimage, 1812, published by John Murray II, and John Betjeman's Collected Poems, published by John Murray VI, 1812, 1858. Now what do these two things have in common other than being books of poetry published by Murrays, do you think? Why am I showing them together? Any takers? Well, it's a bit esoteric. Childe Harold's Pilgrimage was the best-selling book of poetry of the 19th century. Byron famously said, after the first printing of the first edition of 500 copies sold in 3 days, he said, "I went to bed one day, woke up in the morning and found myself famous." It was about that sale. Went on to sell 20,000 copies. For a book of poetry in the 19th century, that's absolutely extraordinary. Is the pointer died? No, there it is. So 20,000 copies. John Betjeman's Collected Poems is the biggest selling poetry book of the 20th century. You'll never guess how many copies sold. 2 million. 2 million. People still publish poetry books in editions of 500. So to sell 2 million copies of a book of poetry is astonishing. It was over several editions, over several years. He was at the height of his popularity in the late 50s and 60s and 70s. TV personality, BBC loved him. He was in everything, on everything. So he was extremely well known. And his poetry is wonderful. It's simple, it's accessible and very clever. Far more clever than some of his critics realise. So the two biggest selling books of poetry of the 18th and 19th century, both published by Murrays. Well, this was the famous drawing room of John Murray. He moved the firm from Fleet Street, where his father had set it up, to Albemarle Street, 50 Albemarle Street, where it remained until the firm was sold to Hodders. And only recently was the firm then sold by the eventual owners of the business, and it's now some sort of business consultancy. Still there, and the room is preserved, but you can't access it, so it's now part of a private office. This was one of the early publications of John Murray II, and it's how he made the money for the firm. It's a cookery book. And in publishing, there's a bit of a saying, you know, literature is good for the reputation, but cookery is good for the bank balance. They sell. So this was first published by John Murray II in 1806 or 7. This is a reprint back in 1813. Kept on selling till well into the late part of the 19th century. 500,000 copies of this sold over the lifetime of the 19th century. It's generally called Rundle's Cookery. It's said by a lady, and it is. It was written by Lady Rundle, a true aristocrat, and dominated English cookery market until Mrs. Beeton came along. So it's a very, very famous book. If you ask people who collect cookery books, they all know about Rundle's Cookery. And it was the making of the fortune of the Murray publishing industry. You never think about these things. You think, oh yes, Scott and Byron and Austen, but no, cookery wins. We know Henry Austen went to this room, and this famous picture shows here Sir Walter Scott, Lord Byron, and this is John Murray II, and this is probably John Murray II repeated, we think. And John Murray II famously burnt Byron's journals after Byron's death in that fireplace because he thought they were too salacious to become public. It's generally regarded as the biggest act of vandalism in British publishing history. So he did good things and he did bad things. So this is what we know about the relationship of the Austens with John Murray. In early October 1815, Henry Austen approached John Murray about becoming Jane's publisher. Murray offered Jane Austen $450 for the copyrights of Sense and Sensibility, Mansfield Park, Emma. Now that's interesting. Sense and Sensibility had sold out of its second edition by now, so Murray must have thought that it would be worthwhile publishing a third edition. And Jane wanted to accept the offer. But Henry said no. Henry said this is too cheap, and encouraged Jane to retain the copyrights, as Jane had made more than this sum from the first editions of Sense and Sensibility, Mansfield Park. So Jane retained the copyrights. Now, because of that, the manuscript of Emma did not pass into the possession of John Murray, and therefore did not end up in the National Library of Scotland, where it was otherwise maybe been preserved. So because the family kept it, we lost it. So these little wrinkles of history have big consequences. So here are the John Murray editions then, the first edition of Emma, second edition of Mansfield Park, which he duly published, which Egerton would not do, and then the famous posthumous edition in December 1817 in Northanger Abbey and Persuasion, note dated 1818. Similarly, Emma was published in December 23rd, 1815, but the date shows 1816. This was always done in the 19th century. If you publish in December, you show the next year's date, because currency is everything. New books sell, older books don't. And so you make the lifespan of the book longer by putting the next year's date on. Same thing was done with the Northanger Abbey Pride and Prejudice. Same thing was done with quite a few other people's books through the 19th century. Mansfield Park was published on the 19th of February 1816, smaller edition. If you look at the two title pages, it's quite interesting. This one says London, printed for J. Murray, Albemarle Street, 1816. This one says London, printed for John Murray, 1816, but there's no address. It's one of the very few John Murray books not to have an address. The earlier ones, like the Child Herald, say 23 Fleet Street. Then after that, they say 50 Albemarle Street. I know about 3 that don't have an address. I don't know why it's missing from that book. But it's interesting that Emma is one of the books that doesn't have the address of Murray's on it. Can't explain. Sales of Emma, it did pretty well. 2,000 copies printed. Cost from the Murray papers, you can't quite get it accurately. It's around £500 from the detail I give you. He sold 351 to the book trade for 15 and 16. This was commonly done. I'll show you mine if you show me yours, you know. So I'll sell you a few of my copies to you, Mr. Bookseller, and I'll buy some back from you. Here's the price, discounted price, I'll sell them to you for, but you must sell them at my price to the public, which was 21 shillings. So this was done as a way of book sellers and publishers spreading the risk among each other. It's quite common practice. What we don't know about the details, unless you've got something like the John Murray Archive, which are exactly to the nearest book and price, how it was done. We know that by October 1816 that 897 of the remainders had sold at the full price, and the break-even price for the whole enterprise was selling 280, so they did very well out of it. But it then kind of grinds to a halt. 565 copies still unsold in 1818, and 539 of them still unsold in 20. So it stops. You sell massive numbers when you first release it, and then the sales just fall away.
So first edition for 2 shillings.
First edition for 2 shillings. And they did apparently sell, although there is a story that some of them might have been pulped, but other people think, no, they did all eventually sell 2 shillings. Amazing, really. Makes you weep. For it's, first edition of Emma will cost you somewhere in the $60,000 to $80,000 range at the moment. It's really gone up enormously since I first took an interest and nearly bought one for $20,000, which I wish I'd done now. Here's the cheque that Jane Austen got for Emma, that has survived. But it's not for very much. It's for £38, 18 shillings and a penny. And the problem was that where Emma did well, Mansfield Park second edition did not. And so what she would have got for Emma, she lost on the second edition of Mansfield Park, and that's the net difference. So you can see what happened here. Mansfield Park, 750 printed, about 240 cost, selling at 18 shillings, but look here, they've only sold 160 copies, and they're still not, and they're not selling, and they're not selling. So most of them, the majority, nearly 500 of the 750, are flogged off at 2 and 6pence. So it was not a success, and so Egerton maybe knew something when he didn't print a second edition of Mansfield Park, and it was unwise of Jane to keep the copyright. If she'd have sold it to Murray, it would have been his loss, not hers. So we go. Northanger Abbey and Persuasion, much better story. It sold very well. You see, we know that there are only 282 copies left at a reduced price in 1820 of the 1750s. That's quite good and sold very well. We know that all the profits to this, of course, went to Cassandra because Jane had died, obviously, and Cassandra had inherited the copyrights. And she made over £500 from this, which is more money than Jane, bless her, ever made in her lifetime from her books. So there you go. This is my first edition of Northanger Abbey in the original binding. I would have brought it along. I took it along to when I spoke about it at the Melbourne group meeting, but it's so fragile, I'm afraid I didn't want to bring it to Sydney. It is the only copy in Australia in the original binding, and it's one of, to my knowledge, 6 in the world surviving. So it's quite rare, and I look after it with great care. We know that, as you could see from those previous slides, that all the John Murray ones were sold off in 1820 cheaply. And from 1820 until 1832, no copies were available for sale in England. No new copies were issued, none available for sale. And we know that Cassandra wrote to Murray, because the letters are in the Murray archive, asking for new editions. The answering letter, which would have gone to Cassandra, hasn't survived. We've not seen any, nobody's seen any of those, but we know that the editions didn't appear. So presumably the answer was a clear no. There were other editions, I've just mentioned very briefly here. There were foreign editions of Jane Austen published in her lifetime. We have no evidence that she knew anything about any of them. There's no mention of any of them in her or her family's letters. So she probably wasn't aware of any of these. These are all effectively pirated copies. And then in the 1820s, when the British weren't publishing any Jane Austens at all, French republished all 6 in French. And I've got 2 of them with me here. I've got second French editions of La Famille Elliot, which you don't have to be a French expert to realise which one that is, and Sens et Sensibilité. And you don't have to be a French expert to realise what that one is. They are the first illustrated editions of both of those titles published in the world. And the Famille Elliot is the first Jane Austen book to have Par Miss Jane Austen on the title page, a French edition. And it's interesting, the Sense and Sensibility doesn't give the authorship. These were translated by a woman called Madame Isabelle de Montelieu, and the ones I've got are part of the complete set of her works, which were the second editions in French of these. But the Sense and Sensibility is the first one to have illustrations. So it's the first ever illustrated Sense and Sensibility in the world. Interesting that the French were publishing them, even though some of the story doesn't bear much resemblance. She wanders off a bit, Madame de Montelieu, into her own little fantasies and then comes back to the story again. They're quite interesting if you read French to read them. I'm surprised that no one has actually translated them back into English to allow a wider audience to appreciate. If I had a second life, I might do that. Okay, the next publisher I want to briefly deal with, Richard Bentley. These next 2 I'm going to deal with very quickly. So he was the person responsible for the revival of Jane Austen. This is his publishing history. The key thing to notice, he worked with his brother, then with Cockburn and Bentley. Cockburn was the one who published the diaries and letters of Fanny Burney. They fell out famously. They invented a thing called standard novels, which eventually carried the Jane Austen books. The partnership was dissolved in 1832. Somebody at the time wrote, not only were these 2 not talking to each other, their lawyers weren't talking to each other. Things got so bad. Richard Bentley died in 1871. The firm was taken over by his son George, and George very nicely called it Richard Bentley and Son. They didn't put his own name in, which I thought was a nice touch. And then when he died in 1898, his son, who was called Richard Bentley, sold the business on to Smith Elder. So that's the potted history of Bentley. But what Bentley did is in July 1832, he bought 5 Austen copyrights from Henry and Cassandra, from Cassandra, who owned them, via Henry, for £210. He actually approached them for all 5 because he didn't realise that they no longer owned Pride and Prejudice. But Henry directed him to Egerton's, and he had to find eventually that Francis Pinckney, who was now the owner of the Whitehall Military Library, had the copyright to Pride and Prejudice, and he bought that from Pinckney for £40. So £250, which is what actually he originally offered to the Austens for all of the things. He eventually split the money between Pinckney and the Austens. By 1833, he published single volume editions of all of Jane Austen's novels in the standard novel series for 6 shillings each. And these were the first English Austen editions to feature illustrations, a frontispiece and an illustrated engraved title page, and the name of Jane Austen on the title page, the first ones in English. But more than that, after a 12-year hiatus, there was a fair risk Jane Austen might have been forgotten. So Richard Bentley really rescued Jane Austen for posterity by publishing at this critical time. These are the copyrights, and there's an interesting story in this. So the first 3, you can see, expired not all that long after he bought them in 1832. So, because the rule was copyrights lasted 18 years after the publication of the book at this time. But in 1815, the law was changed from 18 years to 42 years. A hell of a jump. And so it meant that the copyrights of Emma went on till 1857, Northumbrian Persuasion to 1860. This was a huge advantage for Bentley, not just because he could keep on publishing, he had the monopoly of publishing these 3, but he was the only person who could publish the works of Jane Austen in total, because nobody else could publish the last 3. They could publish, after 1842, they could publish single volumes of Pride and Prejudice, Sense and Sensibility, Mansfield Park, but the complete works could only be published by Bentley because of that extension of copyright. And he leveraged off that like you wouldn't believe. And so he published these books first as standalones in his standard novels, but then as sets. And he did very well from the business. He made those copyrights work for him. So here's some of the 1833 ones which I have. That's my Sense and Sensibility, Pride and Prejudice and Mansfield Park, going from left to right. The illustrations look a bit like this. They're very non-authentic Regency. Frontispiece and then an engraved title page. So this is Lizzie asking her father in the library whether there's any news from London about what's happened to Lydia. And this is obviously the confrontation between Lizzie and Lady Catherine de Bourgh in the garden. I don't recall that she had a parasol in the book, but never mind. These are reprints in different bindings. This, in fact, is my Mansfield Park, which is in its original binding. That's important. So it's got these sticky labels which were applied to the spine. They're still surviving in pretty good condition. And it also, as well as having the title page printed, it has what's known as the series title. And the ones that were published as standard novels were given a number, there's 27 in the series, as well as having the regular title page. Now for collectors, this is terribly important. When these are rebound, many rebinders threw away this page. They only left you with this one. So you didn't know if the book was part of a standard novel issue or a series set of issue. So it's quite important. This is my Emma from the same series, so the second edition of Emma, 1833. It's a rebind, but it's from a standard novel series and the standard novel page is intact here. I brought it along here because I know somebody in the audience is quite keen on Emma. So it's the second edition of Emma, and it's in spanking condition. You come and have a look at it at the front afterwards. But it's quite rare to have that, as I say, that series title page survive the Victorian rebinding. Here's one of the best sets. This is my set of the 1856 edition of the Bentley Austens. It was beautifully bound by a London publisher called Wesley. It's the most magnificent of all the Bentley sets in my view. It's quite a cachet first. It's not that hard to find. You see sets of this for sale from time to time, and more commonly individual volumes. I actually bought them all as individual volumes and put the set together, which is, as a book collector, you kind of like to do that. You're kind of reuniting what should be together. And so it took me about 3 years to put this set together. It's always a feeling of achievement rather than buying it as a complete set. Here's the Pride and Prejudice. It's the same picture you can see as the frontispiece, the same engraving on the engraved title page. The engraved title page still says 1833. It's the same stereotype plate used to print it as the 1833 edition, but the letterpress title page has got the right date on it, 1856. So when you're buying and dealing with these, you need to have both those pages present and you need to check the dates on them. Eventually they stopped printing the old date, they redid plates and the date changes. So you need to really know what you're doing when you're buying some of these books. By 1870, all the copyrights have expired on Bentley, but he's clever. So what he does now is he prints them as if they're a set, but the books have got their individual titles. It doesn't say the works of Miss Austen anymore. They've got the individual titles on, and he takes advantage of this because he knows he will sell more copies of Pride and Prejudice than he'll sell of Mansfield Park. So he prints more. And he can still put them together and sell them as a set, or he can sell them as individuals. So he's taking advantage of this current situation. And then in 1871, he gets this book, which says Lady Susan on the spine, which is slightly misleading. It's actually the memoir, but the binders decided to call it Lady Susan, which is bizarre. The second issue of this, it says the memoir on the spine. The first edition says Lady Susan. Yeah, it does have Lady Susan in it as well. 1870 published, and that was interesting too. 1870, the copyright is 42 years. If he publishes the complete set of Jane Austen now, he's got till 1912 by sticking this one in as part of it. Nobody else can publish this till 1912. So he keeps on publishing complete sets by adding this one to the novels. Clever businessman. In fact, this was the son, George. He obviously learned from his father. Okay, so moving on to the last one, and this is an unusual publisher. This is an academic publisher. This is Robert Chapman. He was in the most fortunate position. I envy him in one regard, or two regards possibly, but one big one. So he was an academic at Oxford. He was a professor of literature, but he was appointed just after the First World War as the secretary of the Clarendon Press. That meant he ran the Oxford University Press, the biggest academic press in the world, and he was a publishing, researching academic. Oh, that means he could choose which of his books his press got to publish at the university's cost. Brilliant. I mean, I can tell you as an academic, that's unbelievable for that to happen to you, you know. Wish it had happened to me. And then the other thing he did is he met this rather beautiful woman, Catherine Marion Metcalfe. She was a young tutor at Somerville College at the same time that Dorothy Sayers, Vera Brittain, Winifred Holtby, a series of famous literary women were at Somerville. She was a tutor. She was a Jane Austen fan, and she realised that the texts of the first, second and third editions of Pride and Prejudice were different. So she sat down, she analysed them, she picked out what she thought was probably closest to what Jane Austen intended and published it in 1911 as an updated text of Pride and Prejudice, and she wrote a very good introduction to it explaining what she did. Robert Chapman noticed this and thought, here's a model in this, and he then went and did the same thing with all the other Jane Austen texts, went back and examined them and did the same thing, got Catherine to do the same job on updating and revising the text for Northanger Abbey from various editions and some clues about what it should be, and then took her out of the academic competition by marrying her and making her the mother of his 4 children, and then refusing to acknowledge her activity other than a general thank to my wife in the preface of one of the books. Outrageous behaviour. But there you go, the patriarchy at work. I can only apologise. But the outcome has been very important because all of the copies of the Austen novels that you're reading are based on the Oxford text now. They were published in a special edition of 500, large paper deluxe U-Butte edition in 1923, largely pre-sold to English university and institutional and American university libraries. Hardly a one went into private hands at that point. But then there was such a clamour for them that it was republished in 1926 for the general public. This is my set. Again, a set I put together from the individual books. My Mansfield Park and Emma are a little bit rougher, so I must improve those. And there have been many reprints of these. My current reading copy of Pride and Prejudice is the 3rd edition of this series that somebody has beautifully, artistically bound in a 19th century style binding. And so that's my favoured reading copy of Pride and Prejudice. These made a huge impact on the publishing of Jane Austen for the 20th and into 21st century. He then went on and did the same thing for the minor works, Lady Susan, Sanditon and the Watsons. Sanditon was first published as Fragment of a Novel. He then produced the first academically rigorous edition of the letters in 1932 and had it nicely bound in a false Victorian binding. Some people don't like that. I actually think it's rather nice. I think it's the way the letters should be bound. He published the Juvenilia, although he was beaten to the punch for volume the second because he fell out with the family member who owned that, and they went instead to Hodder's for the publication. But eventually, Southam, who was the successor to Chapman, got his hands on the manuscript of volume the second, got it published by Oxford. And Chapman put together the first collected edition of minor works, 1954. So these are all really important advances in the publication of Jane Austen. And then he published in 1948 really the first serious academic book about the Jane Austen novels, as the Clark Lectures, given at Cambridge but published at Oxford, which always amuses me as an Oxford man. And Chapman's activities generally made the study of Jane Austen academically respectable. You have to remember the First World War, when he started, English literature ended in the late Middle Ages. Yeah, so there's no Jane Austen. A little bit later, sort of Dickens up to George Eliot was brought in. Jane Austen was still not really taken seriously, but Chapman made the study of Jane Austen respectable, and it's very important. And that was carried on by Brian Southam, who was very important in English Jane Austen circles, was the chairman, president of the society there for many years, while running a merchant bank at the same time, an interesting man. But this was basically the publication of his PhD work, and he went through all the surviving manuscripts of the Juvenilia, the unpublished works, and analysed those properly for the first time. So very important additions both to academic but also general usage of these tracts. So that's where I'm going to end. They're the four, I think, most important publishers in the history of publication of Jane Austen, and I hope you've learned something from that. Thank you.
Well, I'm going to start by saying that Chris is wrong. He's not a cabbage, he's a parrot. He went a very long way down with that. I learned so much from that, my goodness. Facts and figures and fascinating bits of information. It was absolutely amazing. So, does anyone have questions they would like to ask?
So the question was, how would Bentley known about Jane Austen's works if they'd been out of print for 12 years, basically? What Bentley's business model was the standard novels were all reprints. So he trailed his coat through as many old books as he could find that ideally the copyrights were expired or could be got cheaply, and then reprinted them in his standard series. So that was the process. How he exactly identified Jane Austen, I don't know. Unfortunately, Bentley archives are not saved. They would have passed on to Smith Elder, which then taken over by Macmillan's. Macmillan still exists and has a Macmillan archive, but the Bentley archive didn't get passed into it, unfortunately. So we don't know exactly how, but that was the process, and so that's how he probably did it. He would have found one of the books. He was old enough to maybe have heard of Jane Austen from when the original editions came out. So we don't know. The most expensive Bentley standard edition to buy is not a Jane Austen. It's Frankenstein. He published the third edition of Frankenstein, the first one with a picture as its frontispiece, and no change from $25,000 for that one. It's the only one I know of in Australia is in the State Library of Victoria. I've been wanting one of those for about 30 years, and the only ones I can afford are in such wretched condition that I won't buy them. So, but yeah, so that's probably through going through and looking for things, and you can see a sort of pattern. It's a good question you ask. You can see a sort of pattern in the things he picked, but I don't know that anybody's actually sat down and analysed the titles other than Michael Sadler did a bit of analysis way back on which books Bentley was publishing. But he was more interested in the book collecting side of things. The question was, do I do repairs on any of the books, or do I just keep them as I receive them? But the Northanger Abbey I showed you, I've kept absolutely as I've received it. I can tell you 3 of the pages in chapter 5 are held together by a 19th century pin going through them. I've left it in place. I bought the book from George Bainton, from Bainton's Binders in Bath, probably the best English bindery. He was, if I just digress and tell the story, he was given this book these books by an English guy. He said, I want these to be rebound in a nice modern shiny binding. George tried to dissuade him, couldn't. And then George sent me an email saying, look, I've got this Northanger Abbey. It's in pretty rough condition, but it's absolutely original. This fellow wants me to rebind it. I don't want to rebind it. I don't want to put a new Bacon binding out. I'd rather it stayed in its original position. We could do some repairs, or you could take it as is. He sent me a whole lot of pictures. He knows I prefer things in their original state. And so I bought it as is. And he said he thought it was stable. If I was careful with it, it would be okay. And I didn't throw it at the cat too often, it would be okay. And so it's there in a fragile, wrapped in, it's in a little box, which he did make me a little box for it. And I wrapped some bubble wrap around that. I do repairs on books. I actually do some myself, if they're simple enough, with professional materials. I took a bookbinding course, so I do know how to do it. You can buy the materials. There's a couple of good shops in Melbourne, and the best shop for the repair materials is actually in Wangaratta, in the country of Victoria, called Archival Survival, great name for a business. They sell all the sorts of bits and bobs you need. And there's another one in Queensland. I've forgotten the name of the firm. I buy some bits and bobs from them. There's a group in Melbourne sell lovely antique papers that you can use. So you can replace end papers that are damaged if they're beyond all hope. And so I'll do a little bit of that. I then have a professional bookbinder who I give the more precious and more difficult things to. So for instance, I bought first edition of John Polidori's The Vampire. It's the first ever English book about a vampire, thought originally to be written by Lord Byron, because there's no author on the title page, but in fact written by his doctor, John Polidori, in the same event that Mary Shelley wrote Frankenstein in, that holiday on Lake Geneva. So I had one of these without its covers, without its wrappers at all. But I got a picture from another London dealer of what the wrapper should look like, and I got my bookbinder to reconstruct the wrapper and put it round it, because I felt it needed that. So you have to make these sort of decisions which are sometimes about preservation, sometimes about taste, as to what's the best thing to do. But I will. There's a thing called tipping in pictures, where pictures on glossy paper or coloured plates are stuck into the book. They're not part of the integral binding of the book. You can actually reattach those if you're careful and you know how to do it. I often find books, the dealers are pretty honest with me generally. They'll say, oh, plate 3 is unattached but present. That's fine, so I'll stick it back in. I know how to place it back in. And you sometimes buy books, you find somebody's done that, but they've actually stuck the wrong plate in the wrong place, they've swapped them over. So then you have to make a decision, do I take them out and put them back where they should be? They're never easy decisions, these. Yeah, so I brought, as I say, the second edition of Emma. I don't have a first edition, I wish I did, but I don't. But this is the second edition, there are not too many of those in Australia. And it's in spanking condition. There you are, you can handle it.
Bring it in.
You all saw her take it, didn't you? So these are, which one's this? This is the, these two are the two French editions. So this is the Famille Elliott with the picture there. And it's the title page is lovely. You can come and have a look at it, but I'll just read it out to you. Because it says, La Famille Elliott ou l'Ancienne Inclination, traduction libre de l'anglais, free, I'll say free translation from English, d'un roman posthume de Miss Jane Austen. It's franglais, you know, d'un roman posthume de Miss Jane Austen. And it's the first time Jane Austen's name appears on a title page of any book.
And with the first
1828, and with the first picture. And it's in two volumes, so each of the two volumes has a frontispiece picture. So this was published in 1828. This is the Sense and Sensibility in the same series. The picture, I don't know if you can see it from the back, but it's of a man carrying a woman down in a fairly rough bit of countryside. You can all imagine which event in Sense and Sensibility that is. Will it be carrying Marianne down? It looks almost like an alpine terrain that he's on.
It does, yes. She looks as if she's fainted dead away.
Yeah, and it's quite raison et sensibilité, ou les deux manières d'aimer, which is very nice. Two ways of loving. Once again, dear old Isabelle de Montelieu traduit librement d'anglais. Lovely. She gives her full title, but not Jane Austen on this title page. par Madame la Baronne Isabelle de Montolieu. So they're lovely books. I've been looking for copies of those for, actually I remember telling you a long time ago I was looking for a copy of those, and I eventually found them. And the bindings, they clearly from once were in the same set. I found them at opposite ends of France, one in Paris and one in Marseille. It's an extremely good bookshop in Marseille, which every time I go through that part of the world, I go and visit. The other things I brought, just slightly different. This was the little article by Michael Sadleir, who explained that the 7 horrid novels of Jane Austen were real and not inventions of Jane Austen. And this was published in 1927. It's a terrific piece of work that he did. And he's reproduced the original title pages of the 7 horrid novels at the back of the thing, which is the only time you're ever likely to see them, because these are the original 18th century title pages, which he somehow found. God knows how. And so following that on, an English publisher decided he was going to republish in 1927 the 7 horrid novels. He could only find 2 of them, and I've managed to find them both. And this is The Necromancer in a lovely faux yellowback cover with a gloriously ridiculous picture on the front and an ad for Pear's soap on the back. This is published in 1927 in the style of about the 1860s, in the same year that Sadleir wrote this. So it's in itself, this is a rare book, sort of $500 to $1,000 type book. And the other thing I brought along, as Susanna knows, I'm also a collector of fashion plates, particularly French Art Deco fashion plates, but I do go into other French fashion plates. So I brought 4 along today because they're French fashion plates that were republished in London during Jane Austen's lifetime. The premier fashion, if you hold up to and I'll hold up to, the premier fashion magazine of its day, which was called La Belle Assemblée, probably best translated as the chic gathering or something like that. It's not belle in the sense of beautiful. It's really it's like I collect a French magazine called Gazette du Bon Temps, which really means the magazine of good taste. And this Belle Assemblée is trying to say the same thing. It's about good taste, but the picture is actually French, from a French fashion magazine, retitled in London and reissued in London. And I've just brought 4 along. I think they run from 1809 or 1807, I think the oldest one is, through to one which you can see from the costume style is post-Austen. It's 1828, and you'll see the style is completely changed by then. So it's an interesting area to collect. My interest there is really in the French fashion ones of the Art Deco period, of which I've got a substantial collection. But it's nice to find these English ones. They're quite hard to find.
Chris, it was a wonderful talk. I'm sure everybody was fascinated all the way through it. There was so much to think about, areas of the period. The Fanny Burney area was one that I'm very familiar with, and I really loved hearing about that again, and seeing the pictures of the particular signing of the books. So it was a really excellent talk.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. It's always my pleasure. Thank you.